It's Wednesday, 25 September. Welcome to the President's Daily Brief. I'm Mike Baker, your eyes and ears on the world stage. All right, let's get briefed. We're starting off today with the growing confrontation between Hezbollah and Israel, as new reports reveal that the terror group is pushing its sponsor, Iran, to directly join the conflict. Apparently, the proxy groups don't understand that the reason Iran set up all their proxy groups, including Hezbollah and Hamas, is so that the Iranian regime could avoid taking the heat and accountability. Later in the show, with the United Nations gathering in New York, Ukrainian President Zelensky is stateside to present his so-called victory plan to U.S. leaders. We'll break down what that includes. Plus, with news that Trump's would-be assassin Ryan Routh once traveled to Ukraine, imagining himself to somehow be part of the war effort against Russia, we're now learning that the U.S. government has been monitoring Americans who join the conflict, worried about the potential for violence when they return. And in today's back of the brief, disturbing news from the U.S. southern border, as U.S. Border Patrol agents are reporting that children as young as 8 are being drugged and smuggled into the country by human traffickers pretending to be their family members. But first, today's PDB Spotlight. I want to begin with a look at how Iran is reacting to Israel's massive air campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon, as we learn that the terror group has reached out to their backers in Tehran for assistance. Now, according to an exclusive report from Axios, senior officials in Hezbollah have been urging Iranian leaders to mount an attack against Israel to disrupt their ongoing bombardment of Lebanon. While Iranian officials had vowed that their axis of proxies would punish Israel following last week's pager and radio attacks, the Islamic regime reportedly demurred when Hezbollah came pleading in recent days. Sorry, our calendar's all filled up. We're kind of busy now. Hezbollah officials tried to convince the Iranians to use this moment for their promised retaliation against Israel over the July assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, but were reportedly rebuffed. After nearly 2 months of waiting, it appears that Iran may not have the appetite for revenge. 2 Israeli officials who spoke anonymously to Axios said that Iranian leaders told Hezbollah that it, quote, wasn't the right time, in part because Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian is in New York City this week for the UN General Assembly. He's probably stuck in traffic. And in part because the Iranian regime, well, they far prefer that their proxies are getting bombed as opposed to themselves. U.S. intelligence sources added that Iran also appears to have broader reservations about getting drawn into an expanded conflict with Israel and her Western allies. As we've previously discussed, Pezeshkian reportedly made direct appeals to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in the wake of the July bombing in Tehran, urging him to refrain from any direct attack on Israel. He reportedly feared that Israel's response to an attack could devastate the Iranian economy, widen the internal divide between the regime and its citizens, and potentially lead to the country's collapse, or, well, at least the collapse of the current Iranian regime and the IRGC. There's a thought. But when it comes to Iran, nothing is, frankly, ever certain, and public remarks from their leaders on the fighting in Lebanon are raising Western anxieties that the situation in the Middle East could spiral out of control. Speaking with CNN on Monday, President Pezeshkian said, quote, we must not allow for Lebanon to become another Gaza at the hands of Israel. Hezbollah cannot do that alone. Hezbollah cannot stand alone against a country that is being defended and supported and supplied by Western countries, European countries, and the United States of America, end quote. Now, the statement is vague enough not to really tip Iran's hand, but suggests that Iran's many proxies in the region, whether in Yemen, Iraq, or Syria, could join the fight to aid Hezbollah. Pezeshkian likely chose his words very carefully, given his itinerary this week. Now, despite Iran being the largest state sponsor of terrorism, Pezeshkian was invited not only to attend, but to address the UN General Assembly. Honestly, given how feckless and useless the UN is, I'm surprised that they also didn't invite Vladimir Putin to address the General Assembly. Speaking to reporters in New York on Monday, Pezeshkian ironically claimed that Iran, sorry for laughing, but you'll understand why when I read this quote. Speaking to reporters in New York on Monday, Pezeshkian ironically claimed that Iran wants to live in peace and does not, quote, wish to be the cause of instability in the region, end quote. Wow. There is not a shovel big enough to scoop up that pile of crap dropped by Pezeshkian. Instead, he claimed that it is, quote, Israel that seeks to create this wider conflict. But, we could say, I suppose, that the actions of Iran's proxies over the past year obviously tell a different story. Hamas kicked off the current regional instability with their barbaric 7 October attacks, and since then, the Yemen-based Houthis have wreaked havoc with attacks on commercial shipping vessels in the Red Sea, while smaller Iranian-backed militant groups have attacked U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria. And when it comes to Hezbollah, Israel has taken the gloves off in response to the Iranian-backed terror group's relentless missile and rocket attacks on northern Israel since 7 October. Israel began a massive airstrike campaign on Monday, targeting at least 1,600 Hezbollah military sites in Lebanon, which killed more than 500, including many senior members of the terror group. The airstrike campaign followed alleged covert attacks by Israel last Tuesday and Wednesday, involving thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies carried by Hezbollah members that were laced with explosives and remotely detonated, killing dozens of militants and wounding scores. Israeli officials have called their campaign a proactive measure aimed at degrading Hezbollah's ranks and munitions so that they cannot continue to threaten Israeli citizens. All right, coming up next, we'll break down Zelenskys victory plan, that's what he's calling it, as he meets U.S. leaders during the UN gathering. Plus, we're learning details on the U.S. government efforts to monitor Americans who showed up in Ukraine in the early days of the war, concerned about potential violence when they return. I'll have those stories when we come back. Welcome back to the PDB. Moving to the war in Eastern Europe, Ukrainian President Zelensky is in the U.S. this week to address the UN General Assembly and to present his secretive plan for victory against Russia to President Biden. While Zelensky is holding details of the plan close to the vest and until he formally presents it to Biden later this week, Ukrainian officials issued a statement ahead of his visit previewing some of its core elements. The plan reportedly includes further munitions support and the easing of restrictions on using Western weapons for long-range strikes inside Russia, a renewed diplomatic push by Western powers to force Russia to the negotiating table, and measures to hold Russia accountable for their initial invasion in 2022. And that's all according to a report from the BBC. A source close to Zelensky told ABC News on Monday that overall, the plan consists of 5 points, which include detailed figures regarding the amount of military assistance that Kyiv needs to achieve their goals. The source stressed that the plan does not include any concessions to Russia. But Zelensky will face an uphill battle. The Biden administration still remains reluctant to allow Ukraine to use Western munitions for long-range strikes, fearing that it could cause a significant escalation with Russia. Zelensky also acknowledged on Monday that Russian President Putin currently has no interest in negotiating any concessions with Ukraine. But Zelensky is projecting optimism, telling ABC News, quote, "I think that we are closer to the peace than we think," end quote. During his U.S. visit, Zelensky will also reportedly seek security guarantees from Biden regarding the U.S.'s commitment to NATO to hedge against a potential second Trump presidency. As a reminder, former President Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance have floated the possibility of Ukraine making territorial concessions to Russia in order to end the conflict. Zelensky appears to be in a race against time, saying that his victory plan requires the swift backing of President Biden so that Ukraine can begin negotiations with Russia before the end of the war. Upon his arrival in the U.S. on Sunday, Zelensky said, quote, "Let's do all this today, while all the officials who want the victory of Ukraine are in official positions," end quote. That said, Zelensky is also scheduled to meet this week to discuss the conflict with both former President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. But Zelensky, may already be risking his chances to win support for his plan from Trump. In an interview with The New Yorker released Sunday, Zelensky lashed out at J.D. Vance, calling him, quote, too radical over his stance on Ukraine. He then suggested that Vance brush up on his World War II history. He also criticized Trump, saying, quote, my feeling is that Trump doesn't really know how to stop the war, even if he might think that he knows how, end quote. Well, as he's wont to do, Trump hit back, accusing Zelensky of campaigning on behalf of Harris and calling him, quote, the greatest salesman on earth. Trump reiterated his claim that he could swiftly end the war through direct negotiations. All right. Shifting stateside to the story of Ryan Routh. That's the man who attempted to assassinate former President Trump. Well, okay, he's the second man. We're now learning that the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, has been monitoring Americans, or possibly monitoring Americans, who traveled to Ukraine to fight in its war against Russia, or otherwise to wander around Ukraine in those early days. Authorities were concerned that some might return home with extremist tendencies and possible combat experience, potentially leading to political violence. Now, despite these efforts, Routh managed to slip through the cracks. In 2022, DHS initiated an interagency effort to scrutinize Americans who had traveled to Ukraine's war zone. Officials feared that, much like conflicts in Iraq and Syria, the Russia-Ukraine war might attract American extremists. No, you think? The DHS and FBI worked to gather intelligence through cooperation with Ukrainian authorities and social media monitoring. However, the case of Routh raises questions about the effectiveness of these monitoring efforts. Really? We've spent almost 4 years barely knowing who was crossing the U.S. southern border, and now we're surprised that other monitoring efforts might be less than effective? But I digress. A vocal supporter of Ukraine, Routh traveled to Kyiv in 2022 after the Russian invasion, but was reportedly denied entry into Ukraine's Foreign Legion due to his unstable behavior. Chelsea Walsh, a nurse and aid worker stationed in Kyiv at the time, she crossed paths with Routh a couple of times, as she did with many other Americans who had wandered to Ukraine imagining that they would be part of the fight against Putin. Walsh recalled that Routh quickly became unhinged when he was told that he was too unstable for military service, not to mention that he had no prior military experience. Walsh stated, quote, he was angry and prone to sudden fits of rage, adding that she saw Routh kick a panhandler and berate locals on the streets of Kyiv. Routh's alarming behavior included an obsession with assassinating Russian President Putin, outlining plans involving explosives and cross-border maneuvers to, quote, kill him in his sleep. He later self-published a book titled Ukraine's Unwinnable War, where he wrote openly about a call to, quote, assassinate Trump in retaliation for his withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. Yeah, seems completely stable. Despite these obvious red flags, authorities failed to act. Walsh took her concerns to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, of course, CBP, upon returning to the U.S. in June of 2022, giving them an hour-long interview and sending tips to the FBI and Interpol. She warned, quote, there is one person you need to watch, and that is Ryan Routh. She never received a follow-up. Walsh remains troubled by how easily Routh slipped through the cracks. Again, has nobody been paying attention to the U.S. southern border? Now living near Trump's golf course, where Routh attempted the assassination, she stated they were warned Ryan Routh is a ticking time bomb. Chelsea Walsh wasn't the only one sounding the alarm. Sarah Adams, a former CIA officer, filed a report with the U.S. State Department in 2022 after learning that Routh was wandering around Kyiv claiming to be recruiting former Afghan fighters and promising them positions in the Ukrainian military. Calling his mental state into question, she stated, quote, there was plenty to look into. David Bramlett, a U.S. veteran working in Ukraine, suggested that Routh's rejection from Ukraine's Foreign Legion was the lone red flag needed, indicating that even in the chaos of war, Kyiv's authorities saw him as a liability. Despite this, State Department spokesman Matthew Miller commented, quote, we don't have any record of complaints about Routh. However, Miller conceded someone might have, quote, had a communication with somebody somewhere, end quote. That is a perfect government quote. Now, Routh's long history of criminal activity offers further insight into warning signs that authorities missed. In 2002, he was convicted of possessing a weapon of mass destruction, in this case an automatic machine gun, and an explosive device, after barricading himself during a traffic stop. In 2010, police found over 100 stolen items in a warehouse that he owned, allegedly sold to fuel his crack cocaine addiction. Routh avoided jail time through probations and suspended sentences. Well, and people say that the U.S. criminal justice system is broken. Come on. Retired Greensboro police officer Tracy Falk, involved in one of Routh's past arrests, wasn't surprised at his attempt on the former president's life. Falk noted, "He was kind of out there." That's a fair statement, it seems. Another retired officer noted, quote, "We were on a first-name basis," adding that he had over 100 encounters with Routh. Last Wednesday, Katrina Berger, Executive Associate Director of DHS Investigations, testified before Congress, explaining that her agency receives hundreds of daily tips. According to Berger, Routh didn't rise to the level of immediate custody. Okay. All right. Coming up in the back of the brief, disturbing news from the U.S. southern border as the U.S. Border Patrol reports that children as young as 8 are being drugged and smuggled into the country by traffickers posing as family members. I'll have the details when we come back. In today's back of the brief, Border Patrol agents are sounding alarms over a disturbing trend. Children as young as 8 years old are being drugged and smuggled into the U.S. by traffickers posing as their parents or relatives. Authorities have uncovered 2 separate instances where traffickers were caught with drugged children in their custody. In one case, Border Patrol rescued a child at the California border who had been sedated with sleep aids to prevent him from speaking. The traffickers were found in possession of birth certificates for multiple children with whom they had no relation. This disturbing discovery raised fears, of course, that these operations may be more widespread than previously thought. Border Patrol agents told the New York Post, quote, "A few years ago, when migrants were coming in en masse, we had to let family units in. People kept coming in, and after a while, we noticed that the kids were the same, but the parents were different. They were recycling the kids," end quote. Authorities are worried that many of these children, of course, are at risk of exploitation through child labor or sex trafficking. In another case, on 29 August, officers intercepted Marlon Contreras Lopez, a U.S. citizen, at a port of entry in San Luis, Arizona. Contreras Lopez had 2 drugged children, ages 8 and 11, in her vehicle. According to court documents, she claimed to be related to the children, but officers grew suspicious when the children remained groggy and unable to walk. It was later discovered that there was no familial connection, and Contreras Lopez was charged with smuggling. The children were handed over to Mexican authorities. Under the Biden-Harris administration, the number of unaccompanied children illegally crossing into the U.S. has surged. As of May 2024, federal authorities lost contact with 291,000 migrant children who were released without proper court appearance instructions. According to a 14-page report covering October 2018 to September 2023, an additional 32,000 children failed to appear in court after their release, leaving their fate uncertain. And then you ask yourself, how can the U.S. government not do better? Tens of thousands of children who can't be accounted for. Pathetic doesn't even begin to describe it. And that, my friends, is the President's Daily Brief for Wednesday, 25 September. If you have any questions or comments, please, you know what to do. Reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com. We love getting your emails and your text messages and your faxes and your telegrams and the occasional gift package. And as you may have heard from your favorite celebrities, to listen to the show ad-free, you can become a premium member of the President's Daily Brief by visiting pdbpremium.com. I'm told that celebrities love the PDB. I'm Mike Baker. I'll be back later today with the PDB Afternoon Bulletin. Until then, stay informed, stay safe, stay cool.